So I would like to call the Industry Roundtable to order. This panel begins with a focus on COVID-19 and the cyber supply chain. Howard Grimes was originally the panel chair this afternoon, the moderator, but he could not be with us and sends his regrets. I am Ginger Wright. I am the Energy Cyber Portfolio Manager for the CyberCore organization at the Idaho National Laboratory. And I've got 3 panelists today, and I'm excited to introduce them to you. Our panelists today are Nadia Bartal. Nadia is a managing director at BCG Platonian, a division of the Boston Consulting Group. Nadia has 25 years of cybersecurity technology and management experience across multiple industry and government environments. Nadia co-authored 6 publications by the National Institute of Standards and Technology and led development of several ISO standards on a variety of cybersecurity topics. Nadia was an active contributor to NIST, to the NIST Cybersecurity Framework, NERC CIP guidelines, NERC Control System Electronic Connectivity Guidelines, Cybersecurity Procurement Language for Energy Delivery Systems, and other publications on IT and OT security. Diana Kelly is the Cybersecurity Field CTO for Microsoft and a cybersecurity architect, executive advisor, and author. At Microsoft, she leads the cybersecurity thought leadership team and leverages her 30 years of cyber risk and security experience to provide advice and guidance to CSOs, CIOs, and CISOs at some of the world's largest companies. She's a contributor to Microsoft Security Intelligence Report. In addition to her work at Microsoft, she serves on the ACM Ethics and Plagiarism Committee and has guest lectured at Boston College's Masters in Cybersecurity program. Diana serves on the board of directors for 2 nonprofits, WISIS and Sightline Security, and is also the volunteer CTO for Sightline. Dr. Gail Pomper is the program director for Dreamport, the U.S. Cybercom Innovation Center and Mission Accelerator. Prior to Dreamport, she worked for the Department of Defense as a global exploitation and vulnerability analyst. She has over 25 years of experience installing and designing computer networks. Ladies, thank you for being with us this afternoon. For our panel, we chose again to focus on COVID-19 and the cybersecurity supply chain. COVID-19 has radically challenged the resiliency of America's supply chains, and cyber supply chains are no exception to the effect of the pandemic. Remote working is straining cybersecurity compliance and offering new threats to cyber hygiene. We're seeing increases in opportunistic cyber attacks from phishing to ransomware, and these are affecting both information technology and operational technology systems. Cyber recovery activities are hindered due to a remote workforce and reliance on unfamiliar technologies and workflows. For these reasons and many others, we can be sure that the pandemic has made an undeniable impact on cyber resilience. Our panel members today are well versed in the challenges facing the cyber supply chain, which have been heightened by the pandemic, and they have sage advice for us to adopt. I'd like to begin with Diana and ask, how is the pandemic affecting Microsoft, and which of these changes do you believe will persist?
Yeah, as you can imagine, the pandemic has had a significant impact, and looking at it from 2 lenses, there's how it's impacted Microsoft employees and how we work as a business, but also very importantly is we have to think about how our customers are being impacted and how we can help them through this very difficult time. So one of the biggest, most major impacts, I think, for most information workers is that a majority of us are on work from home. At Microsoft, we are currently on work from home in almost all of our geos around the globe, and we're working very closely with the local governments to make sure that when we bring people back, we're going to bring people back in a safe manner. But right now, we have a optional work from home and through October. So even if local governments say it's okay to come back, we're still trying to really work with our employees and ensure that they feel comfortable going back into the office. So that's been, luckily because of the way Microsoft is and built in our tools, we were able to go remote very quickly, but a lot of our customers were not as able to go remote. They did start to use things like Teams, so we actually hit 75 million daily active users on Teams, which we're all now using Teams now, at the end of April. But some other aspects of working from home, some of the customers that we work with, they hadn't really planned for them, or they had thought that because you could do things like check email, that would be the same as working from, as working from home. But it's actually quite different architecturally. If you're assuming that somebody is checking email, but they're going to come back into the office for big updates on Patch Tuesday, for example, but what happened overnight with COVID was it's like it just flipped on a dime. So people went home and there was no planning about or no strategy for how do we deal with if people can't come back into the office for months. So a lot of orgs that had really felt they were prepared to work from home because people could be mobile realized that they weren't able to work from home the way that they had been working with people were going back into the office. So what did that look like technically? Things like no direct cloud access and using one VPN concentrator, so everybody having to go back to a single VPN before they go back out to the internet, not using things like split tunnels on VPNs, which can really create a lot of overhead when you do something like a large patch program. So we've been working for customers, taking a look and saying, okay, architecturally, were we really ready for a completely remote workforce? And then how do we enable and help people get to that point? Another thing that it's not technical, but it's really been very meaningful, which is how do managers engage with empathy with a workforce that suddenly went remote overnight? And thinking about things like onboarding new employees. You come to a company, you get all excited about being in a new company, but you don't get to go to the campus, you don't get to see the office, you don't get to actually physically be with your new colleagues. That can be very difficult. People who live alone, a lot of stress on them being alone and trying to be very empathic towards that. And also, as people have children and they're now having to do the education for students from home, trying to be very careful to give people space, give them the flexibility to work when they are able to, so that they can also take care of their family, whether it's their children or it may be elderly parents that were living alone, but now with COVID, they want to be with the family, so they decided to do the stay-at-home orders with their family. So that's been a lot of work on how do we engage people as in this newly very remote environment. Looking across technically what we've seen changed, we see 8 trillion signals a day going through Azure. There's some security signals. They come from things like endpoint, cloud, and applications. And we have actually seen, unfortunately, a broad range of COVID-19 themed attacks. 2 areas to really point out. One is, and I suspect everybody at this conference has seen this, the lures, the phishing lures, for example, what the attackers use to reel us in and get us to click. Those have really switched out to COVID-19 branding. So it can be anything from an email saying,
I think we've lost Diana, and I was really hoping to hear her answer. But if everyone is okay, I'll move on to the next question. This question is for Nadia. Nadia, how's the pandemic affecting your consulting firm, and how will these changes persist?
Sure. So for us, very similarly to what Diana was. Oh, I think Diana is back. Do we want to finish?
Yes, if that's all right. I'll just wrap up. I'm sorry. It rebooted. Teams rebooted on me. So technology. So we see the COVID lures, the branding on the lures. The other thing, and this is really, I find this just extraordinarily heartbreaking, is that a lot of the human operated ransomware criminal gangs have been laying dormant inside of agencies like health systems and inside of global aid organizations, and they chose because they know that you're most likely to pay the ransom when you have the least amount of time to spare. They have chosen now to start to turn on their human operated ransomware, and especially in those more vulnerable groups. And then the last thing that we've done is, in order to help people, we have actually opened up our COVID-19 threat intelligence and have made it available. We share it out in blogs, but we also have it available through the Azure Sentinel GitHub and the Microsoft Graph Security API, because we want to help both customers of Microsoft, but anyone in the world who's trying to defend against these kinds of attacks now, to have as much information as they can.
That is wonderful. Thank you. And thank you for finishing that. If there's time between questions, if you could put information in our chat window about how to get to those resources, I think there are a lot of people who would love to get a direct pointer. Okay. So I'm going to turn a question to Nadia. How is the pandemic affecting your consulting firm, and how do you believe these changes will persist?
Sure, thank you. So very similarly, but differently from Microsoft, there is the company itself, and there are clients. And so for the company, the philosophy of BCG before this crisis was that we have to be with the clients. So our consulting teams go on site, they sit in sometimes very crammed conference rooms, and they do work there. Some parts of the company have been more distributed. My cyber team, we actually live in 4 or 5 different cities, so we work remotely, but most of the BCG consultants were traveling to their clients, whether in the city where they live or somewhere else in the country, in the world. So we have to stop traveling. The entire company is working from home. We're used to working anywhere, but not necessarily at home. So the whole gamut of, oh, I no longer have a big screen when I'm in the office, now I have to work with a laptop screen, and I do massive calculations on a big spreadsheet, to will the people be productive when they're not sitting in the same conference room? How we're all going to communicate? How is this all going to work? And of course, the same challenges of different age groups. People have small children, people have aging parents, people live by themselves in a small studio in New York City. We have folks who, I swear, have not come out of their apartments in, let's say, Chicago for 3 months, and they live alone, and we worry about them. And the pivot has been amazing just in terms of people management. We learn how to work from home. Folks get flexible hours, flexible schedules, because you have to take care of a 3-year-old and then do remote learning with a 6-year-old, and then there's something else. And there's all kinds of support for the staff. The amount of meetings that the management had in different versions was unbelievable. At least, well, not at least, for the first 3 or 4 weeks. Then we kind of lined up, and now we were more streamlined than that. But the good news in all of this is that we can work from anywhere. And then, of course, there were cybersecurity implications. We have first-class CISO team, and we care most importantly about client confidentiality. But then you go home and you're in a home network, and then your kids are in the same network playing games. And if my computer breaks, like if it's not usable, I have to ship it somewhere, and then I have to receive it, right? So there may be a period when I have to use a home network. So one of the interesting parts of my job is that the consulting cyber team, we do work for our CISO as well as for external clients, and I lead that work. So very quickly, we got together a list of, this is what you do for your home networks. So we drink our own champagne. We don't like eating our own dog food. We like drinking our own champagne. Very quickly, our teams together put together this, well, if you have to work, you're in a home network, this is what you do. This is what you don't do. Beyond, like, don't let your 3-year-old use your laptop for whatever. And that has been super well received. It's been publicized by our chief risk officer, who provides regular, frequent communications, and we received great feedback on that. The other thing is that BCG is so in consulting, people are your assets. So you have to be people oriented, you have to take care of your people. So we have this thing called People Survey. It's an annual survey, and there's a new cybersecurity question in it now. And the question is very interesting. It's not how well do you do, It's how do you think your colleagues are following, or do you think your colleagues are following appropriate information security procedures? And what this question does, it helps the person abstract themselves from, well, I'm not evaluating myself. I am providing a view of how I think others are doing in an anonymized, non-stressful, non-pressured environment. And this approach is based on some research we did with the MIT Sloan Cybersecurity Consortium. We have a whole culture survey that we provide for clients that looks at not how well are you doing, but how well are your colleagues doing. And so it was really interesting to see that type of a question worded in a deflected way in the survey. I'm waiting to see what we get back, but it was really a really good thing to do. As far as the clients, they've been super understanding. Of course, clients all went, with a very small exception, they went on work from home. And even when they didn't want us on their site. So one of the first things we started saying is, coming up to the crisis, please don't come in. And that we have not yet in any large quantity been invited back. So, you know, with clients, we now all wear whatever, you know, the pajamas or sweatshirts on Zoom or Teams or WebEx. And yes, we can collaborate and it works. And it's okay. And everybody has different children, pets, parents, you know, spouses, significant others floating around. What we see is a lot less travel coming out of the crisis, both for us and for our clients. I think we all learned that we don't have to be physically next to each other. It would be great to have some proximity, but, you know, based on local standards, et cetera, and guidelines. And we also see a huge push for digital transformation. The world will travel less, work from home more, things will be ordered online versus going in physically somewhere. And our clients are looking for help. How do they quickly do that? How do they get there? We have this concept of flatten, fight, future. I believe that flatten is now. We're coming out to flatten into fight for the next, whatever, 12 to 18 months. We're going to be working on coming out of the crisis. And as we emerge into the future, the world is going to turn digital, and our clients are going to have to be digital to survive. And so that's how we see the world evolving.
Those are great insights. I'm particularly interested in the handbook you referenced and the study with deflected questions. I bet several of the folks on in the conference would love to hear a little more about that.
So what I can offer is an article we wrote and we put publicly about just some basic best practices. I can put the link into the chat. Some basic best practices on what companies should think about as they have to deal with everybody go home with a laptop, or everybody go home and work from a home network. Doesn't matter. I mean, customer service is being done from a home computer over home Wi-Fi. And so we put together a very quick article on basics, on the basics. So I will, while we're proceeding, I will put the link to that into the chat. Absolutely. Happy to do that.
Thank you. Gail, I was hoping that you could tell us about Dreamport and how Dreamport's missions are pivoting due to the pandemic.
Thank you. So nice to be here. Really appreciate this opportunity to be on the panel and talk a little bit about some of the things that we've been able to continue at Dreamport. So one of the things about Dreamport, I think, which might be a little different from other places, is that Dreamport is part of the essential mission. So there are a number of projects and so forth that we were supporting there that we needed to continue to support. One of the things is that, we are, Dreamport is, first of all, an innovation center and mission accelerator. So what do we mean by that? US Cyber Command is just over a year old. And when you become a new entity in the DoD, one of the things that you need to do is to really, start to reach out and inform people about your organization. And we needed to socialize the whole idea of US Cyber Command, with the American population. And what better place to do that than in a facility where you can do collaboration. So the first thing is that when we talk about Dreamport, we talk about the facility that we have in Columbia, Maryland, where of course people can come physically. But Dreamport is really a program. And it's a program whereby folks in the cyber mission forces are able to come to us and say, we have a need. And we think we can characterize this need in an unclassified way. And we would like to be able to work on this program and be able to serve that need. So what happens is that in most cases, some number of members from a particular team will come into Dreamport to work on that program. And while they're there, they also have the opportunity to be able to collaborate with industry, with academia, with the labs, of course, and to do that in an unclassified way. And why do I talk about the unclassified part of it? Because when it's in an unclassified facility, it means that we can have a much broader palette of ideas that we can bring together. We don't have the same kind of limitations. We don't have to have visitor requests and so forth and so on. So at Dreamport, one of the things we've done is part of that outreach piece were things like tech talks and having events where we would bring people in and we would talk about, security for small manufacturers, or we're talking about, just small business in general and ways that we can help small businesses better protect their digital footprint and so forth. Most of those things went virtual, right? So there are a number of programs which were at a really important stage. One of them was socialization we were doing for the Office of Small Business Programs and the Department of Defense for the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification. So this is a brand new set of sort of acquisition standards, which basically say, if you are a member of the defense industrial base, there's going to be an expectation that you will have some level of security based upon the kind of work that you're going to be doing for the DoD. And, here is how we're going to talk about that. We're going to lay it out in levels, right? So this is a very different way of doing business than we have in the past. In the past, when somebody is getting a DoD contract, they're basically just required to sign something that says, yes, we're secure, right? So it's basically like a self-certification. So this is something where there's actually going to be, assessors and so forth and so on. There's a set of national conversations which were in the process of being staged. Those national conversations were going to happen every 2 or 3 weeks. So there's going to be a big event somewhere, and people were going to have the ability to be able to one-on-one talk to DoD executives and so forth about how this was going to work. There's a training program for it, all of these things. All of those national conversations have had to go virtual. So they're having to be pre-recorded. And of course, we're doing that at the Dreamport facility. So that's one of the ways in which we've sort of pivoted to say, we don't want to stop this important information from getting out there, because when we come out of the pandemic, we want to do everything we can to ramp up our ability to do business with the federal government, right? So we don't want a new set of, security requirements to be something that slows people down. So I would say that that's really how we've pivoted. Other parts of the government, how will they be affected? How are they being affected? I can tell you that in the community where I work, the unclassified work is one piece of that. Obviously, not everything that I do happens in an unclassified space. That has been a very difficult transition. And I would say that there's a lot more thought being put towards, are there some things which we traditionally do in a classified setting, but are there some ways we might be able to do that safely in, a facility that doesn't have that classified clearance, right? So there's a lot of conversations happening. Right now, of course, what happens is, if you're an essential worker, you have something that you have to do in that area, you just have to go into work. So we all have special letters to say we can be on the highways and so forth and so on. And so, you agree when you come and you take these kinds of positions that you're willing to be put in harm's way, et cetera. This is just another way that those workers are more or less in harm's way. There's a lot the DoD is doing to try and ensure that we maintain the workforce and so forth and so on, and everything that can be done remotely is being done. But I think we've probably faced some of the same challenges as business, where we were not used to having that many people online at the same time. We also were using Teams. We had some people who'd never used it before and needed to learn how to use it. I'm one of them. I used to use Zoom all the time, and my office was like, "Oh, I'm sorry, you can't use Zoom. You have to use the platform that we've set up for you." So those kinds of things, I think, are how we've sort of pivoted and changed them. We've learned how to use new applications, and we're trying to think through how will we continue to do this, right?
So for you, like many, it sounds like remote engagement is the name of the game, and each person has talked about kind of a different style of remote engagement, whether it's directly with your customers, your employees, or the mission. And I have certainly seen strain and a need to develop resiliency in all three. And Gail, I think there is a question in the chat that you might be able to answer about whether the standards you talked about apply to universities or just defense contractors. But while you're thinking about that, I'm going to ask Diana about threat vectors. What new emerging threat vectors to cyber resiliency is the industry facing today, and how are they emerging?
I think one of the biggest threat vectors to cyber resiliency is actually the mindset, because cyber resilience really depends on an assume compromise mindset. And it could be, if you're not working in security, you're not steeped in it, you haven't done it for a long time, that can feel like failure when you hear assume compromise. But we can't forget that in the real world, we assume compromise all the time. And in the sense that we understand that we can't never get a virus. We're all trying very hard not to get coronavirus right now, but we understand that viruses will get into our systems, and we look towards very strong, robust immune responses in order to attack and combat that virus. So it's very similar in a network too. The assume compromise doesn't mean give up. It means that when you look at the triad of protect, detect, and respond, that you take detect and respond very, very seriously. You don't focus only on protect, only on keeping that out. And if you can't get that mindset within an organization, then the threat is that it won't actually be adopted. So you want to, the first thing is to make sure that you've got that mindset going within the organization, and that they understand a resilient systems strategy. The next big hurdle is also a very personal one, which is that getting the board to understand cyber risk. Very often in board conversations, they'll talk a lot about business risk, about competitors, about if you're cannibalizing your own offerings. But when it gets to, well, we've got to talk about cyber risk, that can take a back seat. That means that the organization's not going to be making coherent cyber resilient decisions together. You need to bring the board into these conversations. They don't have to understand everything about how the technology works, but we've seen this so clearly now with COVID that, and as Nadia was saying, all businesses are digital businesses right now. We're all using digital technology. We're all leveraging the cloud. Thanks to the cloud, this is one of the reasons that we can bring together this kind of a virtual conference. But the board needs to understand how much digital and technical risk is now able to impact business risk, and bring those together, because otherwise it's going to be very hard to implement cyber resiliency, which really just requires a long-term strategic mindset and not just responding to every attack as it happens. So boards must be able to address that, and if they don't, that's a big threat. Another threat, this is also a bit of a mindset, but it's the security Groundhog Day. So repeating the sins, the mistakes of the past again and again, so that you get back into the same loop. There's also the iron triangle, where they say, you can do faster, cheaper, more secure, only pick two. And it's not an only pick two, it's not brittle. We need to have this very flexible and not dogmatic approach to build cyber resilience into and throughout the fabric of the organization in order to be able to execute on it. So on the technical side, though, very briefly, the technical impacts, some of the pieces that we're seeing a lot of are as IT and OT, the information technology and operational technologies. As those two parts of the network are converging, they're not converging in a cyber resilient way, because OT has had a way that they've worked for a very long time. A lot of it was basically that very much protect without that detect and respond. So not being able to bring those together in a normalized and harmonized fashion can be a big risk to organizations, especially because the OT side is all about availability, and that's where so much of the risk for the organization lies. Another piece is in SOCs, looking at security operations centers and the security event information management tools that are being used. You need, for cyber resilience, you need that detect and that respond. And that means that the tools that are monitoring your systems have to be able to detect as quickly as possible, so that you can have your analysts or your automated tools, where appropriate, be able to respond for you. But a lot of these technologies are very old. SIMs were originally introduced back around 20 plus years ago, and some of them have just not really become modernized. And that's an absolute requirement for cyber resilience. Again, as we've seen, the lore is changing right now to be COVID based. You need to have your tools be able to pick up on that. You could have a lot of analysts writing a bunch of rules, but if you can have machine learning tools that help you look at behavior rather than just what's that lore say, it's what if you click through, does a script run, does an executable run, is a CNC, a command and control server called? That's behavioral. That's where machine learning and modern tools can really help us as these new and emerging threats are pivoting or changing, being able to respond to them very quickly.
So I'm curious about machine learning and how we can readily adapt those tools. But I want to respond more to, you talked about IT and OT converging, but not converging in a cyber resilient way because of sort of how both are crystallized in their own methods of working. And I wanted to turn to Nadia and ask about industrial cyber resilience, and what is your organization, what are you seeing as the emerging threats, particularly to operational technology resilience now, and where do you see them coming from in the future as this convergence continues?
That's a great question. So the threats are coming from people. Technology either is there or will be there. There is 1,000 cybersecurity startups stood up every day, and there's plenty of technology to go around, but it's all about people. Cybersecurity is difficult. It's hard to change people's minds. It's hard because you can't see it when it's there. You can see it when it's not there. My favorite, most recent analogy is that most of us didn't know that toilet paper was so important until it became unavailable. Unless you grew up in the former Soviet Union like me, you don't know this concept. But there we go. So it's sad that I say that what I do is like toilet paper, but it also, people actually get it because, oh, then now we understand. And it's also like parenting, because I couldn't give my children a complete list of everything they shouldn't ever possibly do when they were growing up, right? And kids are smart, they're creative, they will do something that we don't foresee, and they don't know that it's bad. So we really need to change the cultures and the minds. I was struck by Diana's analogy of we need to go more into, we need to be resilient and we need to, it's okay, the concept is okay. And recently I was talking to a former police chief who is now a cybersecurity expert who said, well, those folks who grew up in the defense environment, like cybersecurity people who came from defense, They think about it as a castle. It's something I must protect. Things must not get in. As a chief of police, this person is used to the different concept. He is used to a concept of where in the community, the bad people are somewhere here. We have to deal with them. And I think as an industry, as a specialty, as a discipline, we have to get into that mindset. It's here. We have to figure out how to deal with it rather than we have to protect and not make sure nothing happens. I was also, I caught the very end of the last panel where discussion of metrics. And I think for a very long time, we in this discipline have allowed ourselves to be, to let perfect be the enemy of good. We don't know how to do perfect cybermetrics. Fine, but we need to figure out how to do imperfect metrics that help us communicate with the boards, not in perfect engineering terms, but in the ways that they understand. What is the cost of security, or how does security help improve the value? There is an argument that if we design security in faster, reduce cost, reduce rework, then we can put a secure, better product out to the market, and it will bring us more revenue faster. So we'll spend less, we'll make more money faster. Security is a business enabler. But we're still figuring out as a group, as a community, how to do this. So going back to OT and IT, OT is a very different culture than IT, right? It's people grow up making sure that things happen the way they should happen. They have different educational background than folks coming from IT and security. By and large, they're older. There's a generational gap. They communicate differently. And so the challenges that I see come from this: how do we blend these cultures in a way that they can work together? How do we upskill IT into OT, OT into IT? How do we communicate and make sure that there's a collaborative thinking happening that allows us to securely achieve IT-OT convergence?
That is a really difficult problem. I know at the Idaho National Laboratory, we've developed a monograph and some thinking about cyber-informed engineering, some ways that we can take those engineers that believe, even with evidence to prove otherwise, that things work the way they're supposed to work, and help them think about cyber risks and invite the cyber and the IT side to help them, but they can be in control of the conversation. Because often what I see is the engineer wants to bring in the IT person and hand them the clipboard and say, here's my thing, go check it off, please. And that certainly won't work. And I loved your castle model. Someone asked me once, what single class would you add to the freshman part of a cybersecurity curriculum? And I said, medieval castle siege warfare, because I think today's cybersecurity analysts will learn the most from that, and then they can learn to code later. But those lessons from ancient siege warfare are relevant today, maybe even more than they ever were. So Gail, speaking of siege warfare, that brings us back to DoD. How do you see the threat landscape changing? What are DoD's developing new interests that are coming as a result of COVID-19? And what are some of the impacts of this virus and this time on DoD?
So I'm going to say that the kinds of things that we're working on haven't necessarily changed all that much because of COVID-19. I think that we are still concerned, with the idea that people need to be more aware about what their cybersecurity posture is, and we're trying to put in place all of the things that will help people kind of get to that point. The first thing is that we need to design security in, right? So this is sort of a mantra that we started, more than 10 years ago, but it hasn't really taken off well. Part of that is because we need to really engage our educational partners And that's one of the things that we do at Dreamport, is try to pull in university folks into whatever conversation we're having. And so when we talk about something like the CMMC, which, is going to be something, it's going to be a very different way of doing business. There's basically a planned 5-year timeline for, the complete rollout. But the idea is that we are kind of trying to break it up into pieces, right? So there's 5 different levels. And, you sort of start, you learn what that first level is, and you do all of the things that you can at level 1. And level 1 is, I'm not going to call it cost-free, but it doesn't require you to go out and buy hardware and software. It requires you to kind of look around you and look at your processes and how you handle information. So here's an example. If you're a small company, one of the things you might do is you might offer an internship. And the question is, when you're doing those internship applications, do you use the same level of rigor to select an intern that you use when you're selecting an employee? Often, if you're an engineering company, you're a company that is building something, you might be bringing in something from graduate programs. So a lot of graduate programs, have a high percentage of folks who come from other countries. So, when you're thinking about putting these different people in positions and what they're going to be working on, what kind of access they're going to have to that information and so forth, are you thinking about the fact that all of that information might not be something that you can really protect yourself by asking them to sign, one piece of paper, right? Are there other things that you really need to put into place to ensure that your information is being protected, it's not being carried outside your company, that sort of thing? So anytime the federal government gets involved in some kind of rulemaking, it's because there's some activity that is ongoing that we feel like is not really going the direction we'd like it to go. And when we're talking about things like IT and OT, there's a lot of effort that's put into securing IT. I think people feel like they know how to do that. They understand, well, I need to encrypt my hard drive. I need to encrypt my communication. But what about the information that you're sending to that new robot that you just installed in your factory to improve your processes, or to automate something? Are you thinking about it from that standpoint? And I would say that in general, we tend not to be thinking about that. Maybe the very, very largest companies might be thinking about it, but if you go across the board and you just walk into a factory and you kind of look at the way things are laid out and so forth and so on, they're very safety conscious. What we'd like to do is to see them take that safety consciousness and make it be safety and security, right? So that's one of the things that we're trying to do. And these kinds of things can only happen by, continuing to have the conversation and inviting people in and sort of demonstrating how you can do some of these things, and also showing them, how things are or are not secure. So if you go back to the whole idea of COVID-19, you were mentioning earlier about, or there was a discussion earlier about how people are taking messaging and the phishing messages, and they've adapted it to COVID-19. So this is really about, this is still really about trying to get after people's information, right? And so those same kinds of phishing attacks can be attacks that you initiate against, folks who have, manufacturing information, some new manufacturing process that you'd like to know about, right? So I think the biggest difficulty that we have is people really recognizing what their crown jewels are. What is the thing about your company that your competitor would most like to know? And what do you think they would be willing to do in order to get that information? And I think as, businesses, and especially small businesses, we're really much more focused on let's get our processes in place. Let's get the product out the door. Let's figure out, what's the packaging? What should the packaging look like? Those kinds of things. How do we get the next version out there? We still don't have those folks on our staff who are helping us do that in a secure way. I'm in the process right now, not as part of my Dreamport work, but some consulting work that I'm doing on my own, helping a university build a cybersecurity program. And in the course of doing that, I was going over a book which has been published out of George Mason University, and they're talking about the whole idea of testing, right? And the fact that if we actually want to build something which is secure, we have to have testing processes in place all along the way to know that at every point we're creating the requirements, there's security requirements there, and we can test the requirements to know that they're going to be able to be executed securely. And the fact that there are all of these different roles that should be filled from that testing standpoint. And yet there are still many curriculum, computer science and engineering curriculum where you can graduate and you do not have to really have had any, testing, whether it's security testing or other, or even cybersecurity, right? There might not even be a requirement for you to take a course in cybersecurity before you're graduating with a degree in a field where you're absolutely going to be making something, whether it's software or hardware or building processes for factories. So, from a DoD standpoint, what do we want to do? We want to influence folks to be thinking about the problem that way. And of course, from a DoD standpoint, many of the devices and many of the things that will be made, whether they're software or hardware, might be going into something which is very important, in some kind of a weapon system or some kind of protection mechanism or whatever that is. And we certainly want those things to be secure throughout the entire supply chain, right? So.
Thank you, Gail. I heard a theme emerge from our three panelists that although technology is a tool that we use to implement many things, cybersecurity is all about the people and, more importantly, the imagination of the people involved. And Gail, I agree with you. I am surprised at how many graduates I see coming out of a computer science curriculum who have never had classes like assembler or architectures, and they learn these languages that are very abstracted from the hardware, and as a result, they have a degree in computer science, but fundamentally they don't understand how a computer works. And so that's one of the ironies of the modern university education system, and something I think we as older learners in this environment who had to go through those particular tortures and learn that as a part of our degrees can give back. So Diana, this leads me to you and the security development lifecycle. Tell us about what Microsoft is doing with the security development lifecycle and how you ensure that it's practiced for your product development and maintenance, and how you take that that very important learning to others.
Yeah, and actually, before I say a little bit about our SDL, I actually liked building computers. So some people like that. I kind of miss I actually miss the very hands-on, when you could get into systems and you swapped out, the components, and now it's all like these closed loops. But anyway, I also miss command line too. So so Microsoft, we really take what Gail was talking about, that secure by design approach and building security in. We take that very, very much to heart at Microsoft. Back in January of 2002, we launched our Trustworthy Computing Initiative. And the purpose of it was to help make sure that Microsoft products and services were being built with high security, high availability awareness, reliable, and with business integrity. And what came out of that for software development was the software development lifecycle, or the SDL. and it was developed by someone who still works at Microsoft. His name is Mike Howard, and we've published books on it. If you're into secure life cycles for software development, I strongly recommend taking a look at Mike Howard's book, because it's really one of the sort of the seminal works in the field. But the SDL obviously was very important to Microsoft itself, and it became an integral part of our software development process around 2004. And the development, implementation, and improvement of the SDL, it continues to represent our strategic investment in the security effort and our commitment to, again, making sure that our software is secure, available, reliable, and built with business integrity. The evolution, of course, along the way has changed a little bit. With, we have different tools and new models, and it's really matured over time into a well-defined methodology that is used throughout our life cycles and as we develop products and services. With the rise of mobile, cloud computing, Internet of Things, and artificial intelligence, we've continued to evolve the practices because the technology has not stood still, so our life cycle does not stay still. But it's always built on that same foundation of build security in and weave security throughout the entire process. We also have security and privacy considerations throughout all the phases of the development process, because in security and privacy, very often, if you're not thinking of them at the same time, you may find that something that aids in security may not be the best for, security may be about surveillance and being able to get in and monitor everything that may actually violate privacy. So it's critical not only to have security throughout the entire process, but also to make sure that's going hand in hand with privacy understanding and development throughout the entire process. And you do want to look at it throughout the entire life cycle, because if you try and build security in at the very last minute, it's extremely expensive. The engineer Barry Boehm created some really good modeling around the cost, and these numbers can go up and down. So I've seen some really wild numbers. It's 9,000 times more expensive to try and bolt on security at the end. It's definitely going to cost you money. And if you've ever been in a development life cycle where you're just around acceptance testing and the business is ready to launch, you've advertised to the customers it's coming, you've been talking about these features and functions, it's actually part of the, it's on the balance sheet going forward for the next quarter, and there's some very high sev crits within the software. Trying to stop that launch at that point is going to have massive repercussions for the business. Not stopping the launch at that point is going to have massive repercussions at the business. That's what you don't want to have. How do you avoid that? You have security throughout the entire life cycle, starting with the design requirements and through architectural, and then on out to implementation and launch and into production. So it's very critical to have it all throughout the life cycle. That's what we do with the SDL. Does it mean that you're perfect? With very large, complex code bases, it's darn near impossible to be perfect, but it's important to look at progress, not perfection, and not give up and continue to do all the artifacts and the actions along the way to help organizations, to help make the security, the software that you do release as secure as possible when you release it. And we have very quickly 12 practices within our SDL, and it starts with providing training. And the reason is, as Nadia was saying, resiliency goes to people. The people are your developers. If your developers are getting incented on that faster and cheaper, that they're not necessarily going to take the time for the more secure. They don't even know that it's valuable. You have to make sure that the business, that the organization shares with them that it matters. That's why we educate at Microsoft, and we believe it's important to educate everybody within that model for best practice. Defining those security requirements, get the stakeholders involved. Maybe you need to bring lawyers in that are going to talk about privacy. Bring in HR when you're doing the requirements. It can be, make sure it's a village. If it's only the engineering team, then they're going to look through an engineering lens. That's not necessarily wrong. It's not as holistic and whole as you want to make sure that you have a truly resilient software. Look at the metrics and the compliance reporting. So what constitutes what's acceptable to launch, so you don't get into fights down the road of, well, it's only a couple of vulnerabilities. Maybe they're not that bad. They look difficult to exploit. You want to have those metrics up front so that you're going to avoid a lot of churn and friction on the back end. very important, do your threat modeling and do this throughout the process. Understand where that software is going to run, what it's going to interact with, who the users are, what the compliance requirements are for that, the data or the transactions that software or the workloads that software is going to be working with. And then if you can't, in the threat modeling, you're going to find things that you can't solve for. There's no perfect in security. So what are your mitigations? What are your controls to address some of the potential exposures? The design requirements themselves. I actually had a CISO say to me once, I was talking about application security testing, and she said, you know, that's too expensive. And I said, well, how do you create secure applications? And she said, we do the architecture. We find almost all of the potential problems in the architectural phase. So, which is true. The earlier, the better. Again, that secure by design mindset. Define the use of cryptographic standards. This is something that trips a lot of organizations up if you don't do that carefully, and educate your developers about it. And back when I was doing assessments, my heart was very, very sad when I found out that a developer had gotten the requirement to encrypt data and had tried to create their own encryption algorithm. Of course, it was a terrible algorithm and it wasn't really protecting anything. But wow, they actually went that extra mile. They wanted so hard to be right that they tried to create their own algorithm. If they understood the cryptographic standards, how to use the libraries, what libraries were approved, they could have used really strong encryption and probably saved a lot of time. So make sure you communicate that. Managing the security of the risk of the third-party components, software composition analysis. Most code is not written line from line scratch anymore. It includes different components that developers are using, so bring that in. Tell them what tools they can use and so that they know which ones meet your security standards. Perform all kinds of testing, static testing, dynamic testing, penetration testing, and interactive testing. So all the way from when you've got code snippets, doing the static analysis, to when it's just ready to be launched, doing dynamic analysis and maybe human-assisted penetration testing. And then the last component of the software development lifecycle is to establish an incident response process. Because again, that assume that the resilience, assume compromise, make sure that if something happens, that you have a way to respond and address those new threats as they emerge over time. And the final thing about what we're doing for our software and our development lifecycle, and again, that we share with, that's why we shared the SDL, because we think we worked on it. It's a good, robust plan, and we want to share it with others. Is we also, for open source users, we recently released an open source tool called the Microsoft Application Inspector out on GitHub, and it's a source code analyzer that answers that composition, question of what's in it. So it uses static analysis with JSON-based rules engine, and it's really good for scanning components before use or detect feature level changes, and that can help organizations as they're creating their own SDL and building security in.
So I've been a fan of Microsoft's secure coding products since Code Complete. I still have happy memories of reading that and learning a great deal from it. So I'm glad that work is continuing. Nadia, I'd like to ask you about security capabilities that you're advising your clients to build into their product lines, especially since a lot of these are the engineering-based products that we think about, where again, sometimes secure by design may not be a part of the world that those clients live in. And how is that advice changing due to the pandemic?
So this is a great question, and it is so helpful to have this really interesting conversation in this panel because I think we're all agreeing on a whole number of things. We're advising our clients that they have to create cyber-safe products, and they do so by adopting the culture of cybersecurity is like safety. Nobody wants to be the cause of that industrial, that dial to go back to 1. We've had 0 incidents for this many days. Well, cybersecurity should be the same way. And cyber-safe products require the same approach. We advise our clients, especially now that everybody wants to be digital, to design security in. And I think it's Sec DevOps or DevSecOps on steroids. It's think about implications of the product or the process or the concept being misused before you start anything else. Because, you know, human beings, we're very excited. We love our toys. We think up new concepts. And then eventually we say, oh, but that things can be done with this. And we've been burned so many times in human history and in the history of technology. So we're advising our clients to really design security in from the start and think that way so that what comes out on the other end is resilient. We're also advising our clients that there are 4 million unfilled cybersecurity jobs in the world. Coming out of the pandemic, many people will need to be reskilled into something else. And this is an opportunity, rather than letting their employees in maybe not as pertinent specialties go, organizations can take these employees and reskill them. We looked at the NICE framework and we discovered that we believe that based on the NICE framework, at least 50% of cyber specialties overlap with IT skills, and at least 38% overlap with non-IT skills like HR, legal, what have you. So we're advising our clients to be creative about where they get their cybersecurity expertise, and don't try to get somebody that 5 to 10 to 15 years of experience. My favorite is somebody wanted 10 or 15 years of experience in Azure. I don't know if Azure existed 15 years ago. So where do we get these people? Everybody wants the best, the most educated. But we can't make these 4 million people globally overnight. It's hundreds of thousands in every large country. So we're advising our clients to be creative in how they reskill their current workforce into these areas of need. And again, looking at things holistically and strategically, because whether we understand it or not, the world has to be cyber resilient, and it has to happen from the beginning.
That is very, very true. And so with that, I'm going to turn to Gail and ask, where does certification fit into all of this? Because we've talked about workforce development and education and building with good standards. What about certification standards like IEC 62443 and others? What standards are missing today as energy evolves to adopting cybersecurity with coincident requirements like energy efficiency or other drivers that like security and privacy linked together that must be achieved at the same time? And then what can you tell us about the evolution of CMMC and other standards by DoD?
Okay, so I'm going to start by addressing, so the question was about certification to standards like IEC 62443, and of course there are already some standards, you know, in general for IT, similar cybersecurity standards. So this is really a standard that helps us in sort of the ICS SCADA world, right? In the world of, you know, power infrastructures and those kinds of things. So what we're doing is we're saying that, you know, this is one of those standards which is, you know, attempting to say, you know, you can't be secure by just having security for the computers that are in your office and that run your business. You can only be secure if you're looking at security in a holistic fashion. And by looking at the security of individual device components and looking at the security of the devices which take your measurements and feed that information back to other kinds of controllers that may be making decisions about adjusting. If you're thinking about anything which has to do with industrial control systems, we are literally you know, using those devices to manage the way we live, right? How do we get gas in that pipeline from, you know, where it's being, you know, drilled and processed to the consumers who are going to actually use it? There are control systems along that entire path. And if someone were to be able to manipulate that, you know, that could, you know, cause, you know, a terrible environmental accident or you know, accidents where there's actually, you know, threat to human life and that kind of thing. So So anything where we are sort of extending the umbrella of security, that's kind of how I think about it, is a good thing in my mind. One of the things about this particular standard as well is that it is similar to the idea of the cybersecurity maturity model certification, where we are looking at, where are businesses and how likely are businesses to be able to adopt certain kinds of security requirements. So if you're a very small company, you may not be able to adopt cybersecurity requirements that require you to make a huge investment in hardware and software. So this particular certification model does this kind of similar thing, right? It has the different levels, they're levels 0 through 4 instead of 1 through 5 that we have for CMMC, but nevertheless, it's an idea of leveling. And anytime we're, being thoughtful about, how people are going to be able to adopt something, I think that's a good idea. So the other part of your question is that cybersecurity is possibly conflicting for the same resources that we're trying to use for other things like energy efficiency and energy resiliency and those kinds of things. I believe that all of those are requirements that need to be considered at the time when you're doing basic design, that we shouldn't think about just the operation of something, just like we don't think about the operation of a device, in a static way on its own. We always think about the security of it as well and the safety of it. We want to include those cybersecurity requirements. And we also want to think about that device in terms of how much energy it uses, right? So these are all just a list of requirements. And the question is, what things do we include on our list of requirements? And I believe that in many instances in the past, we haven't included the cybersecurity items on that list of requirements, right? And that's really what we want to do. We just want to adjust the way we're doing the requirements, the way we're handling the requirements process, and making sure that we have all the right folks on the team. There's been some discussion here in sort of in the chat that I've been watching. People are talking about the differences between cybersecurity and, for example, computer science. And again, I'm going to go back to this idea that we need to have all the right people on the team, and we need to have people on the team who are going to be able to tell us whether or not we've addressed cybersecurity requirements as well as we can. And that would mean that we have test engineers who know about what those requirements should be, right? It's about having holistic education and having a holistic view when we're looking at those design elements. So the last one, the terms of the evolution of the CMMC. Again, the CMMC is one of the primary concerns with the CMMC is the fact that the DoD kind of has this idea that if you are a very large manufacturer, you have the resources to do cybersecurity well, and it's in your best interest. However, if you're a smaller company and you're making a piece part, a part that's going to be go into some larger construct, some larger, an engine or, some kind of aircraft, it's going to go into, whatever that is, some kind of weapon system. There may not be that same thought about how you're building it, who knows what the design is and so on. It is important in the DoD world that we try to protect information about, the intricate workings of our, various different weapon systems and even, our just systems which are controlling, any process in the DoD world. And that's because when you know those intricacies of a design, that's where you can go in and you can find those sort of soft points, right? Where you can actually manipulate something. And you might be able to manipulate it in a way that you're not able to capture during a normal design review or during a normal test process, right? So that's one of the things that we're concerned about. So for the CMMC, again, it's been set up so that it's a series of levels. Depending upon the kind of cybersecurity, kind of contractor going after, there's going to be a higher level of requirement for cybersecurity requirements, right? So if you are going to be working on something which is, a new weapon that we're going to put in an MRAP or whatever it is, you're going to be expected to have to be paying more attention to those cybersecurity details. The other thing to know about the CMMC is that although we've released a standard at the end of January, standards, new standards like that, new regulation, they are adapted as we start to learn more. So I would expect that there are going to be adjustments in this new standard as we're moving forward. Somebody had asked, are universities going to be subject to that? So the rule is that you're a contractor, right? That you're a DoD contractor. So do universities win DoD contracts? Well, sometimes they do. So I would expect that if you're working on a DoD contract, and depending upon the kind of information that you're going to be handling and so forth, that, there may be a requirement. There has been one adjustment that I've heard about recently, which is that originally there was a sort of a statement made that perhaps this would be for all DoD contracts. And I think recently there's been some discussion about companies that are providing like an off-the-shelf product, right? You're providing paper, pens, office supplies, those kinds of things, maybe would not have the same requirements as somebody who's actually building, a device of some kind or building software, right? There definitely are different levels of risk there.
I think that's good to know. And I know adapting to CMMC is causing a lot of the contractors and federal entities to have to consider some very sweeping and complicated changes. And I am reminded that we are very, very, very close to time. So first, thank you all for making yourselves available today and for this conversation. I know there are some questions that we didn't get to, including a really good one about how to reconcile computer science with cybersecurity and how to teach one within the other's envelope, which I think is a complicated thing, or how to bring cybersecurity talented people out of computer science education. And so I'd like to invite the panelists to stay linked into the chat. As the other group sets up, there may be more opportunities to enrich the conversation. And for the audience, thank you today. There is clearly a need for a holistic approach to security, but as Gail reminded us, without understanding of the very detailed process and the intricacies of how the systems work, having that holistic approach is not as valuable. So that will be a challenge for us in the future of how to have that breadth and that depth all working together. So thank you very much for being a panelist and being an audience member at this particular panel. I'm going to turn things back over to our moderator, and perhaps we can get some music as the next group sets up. Thank you.